The Florida Podcast Network, the voice of Florida. Welcome to episode 6 of the Florida Podcasting News Show on the Florida Podcast Network. It's a special episode, a bonus. Florida Podcasting News keeps you on the inside of Florida's podcasting industry, and one of our latest episodes was just too big to contain in a clip. So here we are.
That's right. On today's show, we're bringing you an entire interview that we did, taking a look kind of at the radio side, getting into podcasting and what that means for all of us independent podcasters as well. Mm-hmm. We have Tony of Now Media, who has worked with the syndicated show, the Bob and Sheri Radio Show, for a very long time. And we're going to be talking to him about all the things he is seeing in radio coming into podcasting.
This is Jemmy.
And this is Glenn. Welcome back to a brand new episode of the Florida Podcasting News Show. If you're new to us, we release these shows on the 1st and 15th of every month, taking a look at the Florida podcasting scene because it is so vibrant here in Florida. Those of you that have visited PodFest or, for the past couple of years know that. We also do a monthly newsletter, don't we, to accompany it, which just came out. It looked great, by the way.
Thank you. And all of our back catalog of the newsletter and the show can be found at floridapodcastingnews.com.
Well, we have Tony on here as a friend of mine from podcasting conferences a couple of years ago. He's a partner in Now Media, and he works with the Bob and Sheri Show, which is a syndicated show, by the way, that I've been listening to on radio for probably 20 years.
And going on and on and on about how much he loves it.
That's true. And also as a podcast for many, many years. And Tony, we're having you on because I really wanted to talk about, there's a lot of conversation with us independent podcasters about radio coming into podcasting and ruining it all. So I wanted to talk to you about that because I don't think that's happening. But you guys started really early in podcasting for the radio side.
Yeah, we started podcasting in 2006, actually.
Wow.
And so that's fairly early on.
It is. And was it just putting out the show at that point? Was that what you were doing at that point?
Yeah. What we decided we would try to mess around with distributing the show. One of the challenges that you have in syndication is affiliates come and go. And it tends to be, more volatile in the radio industry than it is in like the TV industry. TV stations don't change affiliations. You don't go from an NBC affiliate to a CBS affiliate. Right. It happens, but it's very, very rare. Where in radio, stations tweak a format, there's new management, or whatever, you can lose affiliates. So one of the things that we envisioned when we started doing this was that it would be a way to continue to have a presence in a town where we no longer had an over-the-air presence. So we're pretty early into the whole podcasting thing.
When that show, KVJ show, Glenn, that's exactly what they started to do. They started doing their podcast and is taking their show and flipping it because, you're right. I think they've been bought out like 3 different times, something like that in the last few years. It is so volatile and they don't really know, it's good to have your own content, but where does it exist if your radio station gets shut down?
Right. And I think the other part of it is, there's, when you're syndicated, it's what's the tail and what's the dog. So there are things that you need to do when you're distributing something nationwide. And it's true anywhere, and it's true in any business. It doesn't have to be the radio syndication business. In Detroit, people like to have hot dogs on a plate with baked beans and everything and not pick them up. They actually cut them with a knife and fork. In New York, you're getting them out of dirty water on the street, and they throw sauerkraut on it. So if you use that as the example, which is probably a gross example, and if anybody's listening to this while they're eating, I'm sorry.
Unfortunately, we all know what you're talking about.
Exactly. How do you do that nationwide, right? So you're either going to make the Detroit Coney or you're going to make the New York hot dog, and you have to pick one. And that's what happens in the radio business when you are syndicating a show based out of a radio station. And that's what we've always done with Bob and Sheri. So that becomes challenging. And so as ownership changes, and we had 4 ownership changes in 20 years, and 3 of them in 8 years. And guess what? Every regime comes in and we got a new thing we want to do. And so it's very difficult to manage yourself as an employee in that organization, even more so as an employee that has a program that's on in multiple stations around the country. But we've tried to address those things. But at the end of the day, what we ended up doing is taking the business independent, and
that's Now Media, right?
Charlotte is actually a client, right? And Now Media is the company that we founded to do that, so that when we were dealing with monetization of our podcast, for an example, we didn't have to wait for corporate because that's what you were always doing. So from 2006 until 2018, we didn't monetize a single podcast.
And I know that because I listen, and I only started hearing commercials recently, so I know that. Yeah,
right, yeah. Right. And the reason was because the company didn't know what they were going to do because they were going to sell the company, but they didn't tell us. Obviously, they never tell the employees. And then wait a minute, we've got to have one solution, right? We have to have one podcast solution for the entire company. So the entire company is going to be on Megaphone, or the entire company is going to be with Lisbon, or whatever they're going to do.
Is that why?
That's a problem.
But is that why, we really haven't seen radio, other than throwing out just basically copies of their show, we haven't seen radio really getting into this space big until the last couple of years. And I want to get to a conference you were just at over in Europe, but is that why they're finally figuring out the monetization model? Is that why they're doing exclusive shows like you guys have an exclusive show for Bob and Sheri now? Is that the change we're seeing in the last couple of years? Why is this change?
No, I don't believe so at all,
okay.
Glenn. I think what we're seeing now is from the demand side. It's from the advertiser side. Because what the advertisers are saying is, incorrectly so, by the way, they're saying that a repurposed show is not quite as valuable as original content. And again, I'm going to give you one of my great analogies. It's better than the hot dog one, trust me. What they don't understand on the media buying side, because they're not broadcasters, they're media buyers, they don't understand that when a listener listens to the Bob and Sheri podcast and they listen to the Daily Show, they're listening to it for reasons that are different than what the agency thinks. The agency thinks, it's a repeat. You're just listening to the show a second time. That's not really true.
No, that's not true in my case.
And the reason that it's not true, you're not right. It's not true in your case because you can't hear it.
I
and by the way, you have
here.
A day job.
Yeah.
So you got that right. You can't get it there,
right,
even if you wanted to. The other, so that's piece one of it. Piece two of it is this: the average commuter commutes 27 minutes. So, by the way, we do a 4-hour show. So you can't listen to the whole show. So there's something people want to hear that we talked about that we're going to talk about later on in the show, right? Hey, later on we're going to do a movie review, whatever. So there's an opportunity for that. So I actually, for the advertisers, made a graph, and I compared the length of the Bob and Sheri Show to some really long popular movies, like The Lord of the Rings, Titanic, Dr. Zhivago, Apocalypse Now. And by the way, the Bob and Sheri Show is longer than every one of those movies. So if you think about that and you go, okay, somebody's driving to work in the morning. Are they driving for 4 hours? Are they driving to work long enough to watch the entire movie Titanic? And the answer is no. So, we're trying to educate the business, but that's why the radio industry is going, we got to do these short form things. And in my opinion, I think there is a lot of throwing it against the wall to see what sticks, and then doing more of that which sticks. And that's why I think you're seeing so much of this stuff. I think the question is going to be how radio impacts the business. I think it can impact it positively as well as negatively. And I'll give an example. This morning, I live in Denver, and this morning I was listening to my local traffic weather station, as I usually do when I'm getting ready for work. And I noticed it just beginning this week. and it's a promo. And the promo says, on iHeartRadio this week, here are the podcasts you should check out. And it gives information on 3 different podcasts. And they almost present it as if iHeartRadio itself is a podcast. And that these are just, right? So iHeartRadio is the destination, just like Netflix is the destination. And then you're going to see, Bird Box, whatever you're going to see. So it's really interesting. And I think that can be very impactful because these stations are mandated. There's 1,200 of them, and they're mandated to run these promos once an hour. That's an awful lot of people being told that there's a place to go get podcasts.
Right.
So I think that actually can be good for the business, right? I guess it's not good for you if you're not available through iHeartRadio, but the Bob and Sheri Show is, for an example, and many are. So if you went there and you started consuming podcasts, would that lead to some exploration and maybe some discovery, and maybe somebody who's never heard of Bob and Sheri, or never heard of your podcast, or never heard of this one we're on, might discover it and listen to it and like it and become a regular listener. So I think there's some plus sides to it.
Yeah. What's the difference in the conversation behind the scenes? I imagine it's got to be very different between show hosts who are the content creators who have a show that they've been working on for, in many cases, years, that they're very proud of and they want to carry it forward. But yet there's this uncertainty if there's always going to be a radio station to give them the airwaves. And they want to be able to keep themselves front and foremost as content creators in some way. And they're looking at podcasting as an option versus the behind the scenes conversations of the radio stations who are looking for just content for them to own and play on their stations. I imagine when they're talking about getting into podcasts, the conversation is very different. I can see hosts really caring about creating podcasts that they then can own and carry forward as their own content versus the stations who want to create podcasts that they own as their content. How are those conversations playing out behind the scenes?
There's a lot to unpack in that question.
That's a good question, actually.
So let me start some sort of the back end and sort of work forward. So part of what is happening is dependent upon the contractual relationship that the broadcaster has with the talent. Because for a lot of the talent, who, by the way, generally don't have very good legal representation because they don't have an agent. Because agents cost money.
A lot of money. They're like as bad as lawyers. They really are.
And by the way, if you'll put in your show notes my email address, I can do it for a third of the price.
Okay.
Tony's a good agent. He's a good cheap agent. That's right.
Exactly. Just put it in the, just put it. Yeah. I'm the Walmart of talent agents.
Sherry's going to be happy to hear that, by the way.
But much better customer service.
Sure, I'm sure. Oh, much better. So what happens is a lot of times, if not only contractually, but sort of in the more general legal sense, if I do a 4-hour show at a radio station and I decide I'm going to do a 5th hour as a podcast and I produce it in that building, legally the broadcaster owns it because it's using their facilities. So in court, you would lose that one, right? But that's not even an issue because generally talent contracts with the major broadcast companies generally say, we own anything you do. We own your Facebook page, even if it's your personal Facebook page. We own that.
Wow,
and we can control that. So if you say something, because people have been fired over it. If you say something that's untoward or that the station disagrees with on your personal Facebook page, you're gone. So to answer that part of the question, the idea of doing an independent podcast for some of these talent is a non-starter because they have to do it under the umbrella and with the approval of the broadcast company that they work for.
So
the folks
just to pick on the one point again about it's made in their station. So it matters more about where the podcast or the show is produced, the equipment, rather than the RSS feed it's released on. So like if I own an RSS feed, but I produce, I work for a radio station and I produce a show in there. I just go in there and say it's convenience, right? For me to record it there, they could still make a claim on that, even if it ends up on my own RSS. Oh, wow.
Right.
Wow.
Right. So that's a real problem. I think the other part of it is there is a huge group of folks, air talent, who don't understand. They don't understand podcasting.
Well, yeah.
And so they don't want to do it.
Is that changing? Is that changing?
No, Glenn, I'll answer that. I went to the. I just went to the. I was at the Hispanic Radio Conference, and I was on a panel literally called "Podcasting for Radio Dummies." I didn't come up with the name, but that was what it was called. And it's amazing the questions that we're getting, even though just because the perspective of being in radio has clouded their vision for the possibilities of what podcasting can do, and that's to be expected. That's human nature. But I think there's a lot to overcome. It's almost like if you take someone who's a really great golfer, right? They're really good at what they do. But then you want to teach them how to play pool, and how to do billiards. Some of it is the same, or croquet, right? Some of it's the same, but some of it's different, and they might make assumptions as to what those moves and strategies are that are the same, and we have to kind of uneducate them before we educate them, I think.
No, I think that's right, because we're taught these we're taught, as radio people, we're taught jargon, and we are instilled with these principles of radio that may or may not transfer to podcasting, because it's not radio on your smartphone. It's a different medium, and you have to treat it as such. Are there similarities? Yeah, there's some similarities between radio and television, but nobody thinks they're the same medium.
I'm going to tie this into your latest trip. You just got back from Switzerland to Radio Days, which is like our NAB over here. It's a big conference for radio. In Europe,
right?
What role did podcasting play there?
From my perspective, and it's the very first time I attended that conference, so I have nothing to compare it to. I think it's much different, but you have to remember, you have to start sort of backwards a step, and remember that broadcasting in Europe is much different than broadcasting is in the United States. For an example, the country of Norway basically signed all their FM stations off the air at the beginning of this year, or at the beginning of 2018, because there were only 5 of them, and they're all state-run. And they went to digital. They went to digital broadcasting. With digital broadcasting, you can multi-channel. So they went from five formats to 35 formats, and it's a quantum leap for them. Yes, it's a quantum leap for them. But in most cities in America, you can hear 35 radio stations. Just go up and down the dial.
Yeah.
And you can hear 35 radio stations. So there are towns in America that have more radio than the entire country of Norway.
That's true.
So you have to keep that in mind. I think the other thing you have to keep in mind is that so much of the broadcasting in Europe is government run. And the easiest way the best example is the BBC. The BBC has multiple channels, including a world news service, and different formats. And the BBC is, while they do run commercials, they're also funded by a tax on electronics. So when you go buy a TV, part of the tax that you're paying funds the BBC. Same thing if you go buy a radio. So it's really a different world for those folks. And as a result of that, they don't have as much of the corporate pressures that the broadcasters in the United States do, where they are worried about, how are we going to make it through second quarter? What's it look like? And where we have been for the last 20 years, it seems like habitually cutting staff in order to make the industry more profitable. That's not true in Europe. In Europe, there are fewer radio stations. There are more government-controlled radio stations. So as a result of that, there's more persons per station, if I could put it that way, available than there are in the U.S. So it's a much less competitive industry in terms of the number of choices that you have. And guess what? With less choices, every broadcaster can do a little bit better. And are they looking at podcasting? Absolutely. And they're looking at podcasting on a range of things, not only repurposing content, but having their talent go more in depth, much like we do with what we call the Oddcast with Bob and Sheri, where they'll go and talk for 20 or 30 minutes about something or to someone in a way that they can't do in the radio show.
So that's an off-air.
Shorter.
Yeah,
specifically for the podcast.
Jemmy, it has to be because they use the 7 words that aren't allowed on radio.
Oh, trust me, KVJ Show has an after the show podcast. It is, yeah, just
and
cover your hair in your eyes.
Yeah, right. So you do that. This is what you do. And look, and I think it's some of the more entertaining stuff because beyond the 7, Carlin's 7 words, the talent can be a little bit more open about how they're feeling and about their experiences in life and whatnot. That I think build a really strong bond with the audience.
Now,
I think it's a very enjoyable, and it is. I like plays it too. Into the podcast. It plays more into the intimacy of a podcast.
Yeah, it definitely does.
Is there any fear whatsoever? Because, I mean, you just put the fear of God in me a little bit when you're talking about how they can drop the hammer on you on your own, based on content, on your own social media, posts or what have you. So as, Bob and Sheri or any of these other talents out there are doing these off-air podcast segments, I mean, is there any fear ever that they're going to cross the line and really get in trouble?
Well, I mean, I think we live in a time where anything can go wrong.
Yeah, you're right.
And by the way, I say that, and I know it sounds funny, but I don't mean it to be funny. And I'll tell you, after the massacre in South Florida, last Valentine's Day, one of our talent posted on our Facebook page, on the Bob and Sheri Facebook page, that it was a tragedy what happened, and that the line was, when will our elected officials do something about it? And we had a station pull the show, cancel this, because the general manager of the station read into that comment that we were liberals,
gun control,
and that he was a conservative.
Yep.
And right. And so, we're at a really, and this, I know we're talking podcast, not politics, and we'll get back to podcast.
But it all intertwined.
You have to be careful, right? But you have to be really, really careful. So to answer your question, I think that if there's the blessing of management that we're going to do this after the show podcast, or we're going to do a podcast that consists of what happens while the songs are playing, while we're talking to each other during the commercial breaks and the songs are playing. As long as corporate understands what that is and flags it appropriately, I think that it's fine. I think that it flies. I think where you run into trouble as a talent is if you do something that has not been made clear to corporate. I don't think if Bob and Sheri were still owned by a corporation, we could do the Oddcast.
Yeah.
Because I do have to flag it as explicit content.
So then let me ask you this.
And
because
some of them aren't.
No, some of them are fine.
But we have to do it.
Just to cover your bases. Yeah. So you talk about, stations in America having to, because of competitive reasons and whatnot, break down their staff, reduce their staff, break down their staff sounds so dramatic, but to reduce their staff. And then we also talk about them looking for extra, all this extra content. So that leads me to my next question, which is, are radio stations now considering looking at taking on podcasts that already exist and airing them somehow on their stations? Are they looking to acquire independent podcasts that already exist, and how are they discussing doing that? Because I can see so many questions, as far as the length of the show, the content of the show, who controls it, who controls advertising, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. If radio stations are starting to consider doing that.
Well, I think I think stations individually are not. Corporations are. So Hubbard Broadcasting has an investment in Midroll, and Entercom, which has the radio.com app, they also are invested in a podcast aggregator called Art13. With all these guys, I think what they're trying to do is they're trying to have their cake and eat it too. I think that they're trying to, what it appears to me they're trying to do is they're trying to aggregate content in addition to what they have on their radio stations. But I don't think it's to broadcast on their radio stations. I think it's to diversify their portfolio, so to speak,
Gotcha.
so that they own a bunch of radio stations, but they also have a podcast network.
What iHeart is playing around, I don't know if you saw that, they have a station in Allentown that they're going all podcasting.
Yes.
And of course, That's a big experiment, right? I mean, that's just to test the market for sure, because you got these content already being made. You don't have to create content. That makes it easy on the radio station's part. It's whether they can fund it and whether they can make it work.
Is that the AM station you're talking about?
Yeah,
on the last
yeah.
show? Yeah.
Right. It's an AM in Allentown, Pennsylvania. And I would say good idea, bad execution, because you're going to get podcasts listened to on an AM in a non-major market.
Yeah.
Allentown's a suburb of Philly.
And let's be honest, I can listen to that podcast anytime. I mean, on my podcast player, why am I going to turn it on the radio?
Where I can't rewind.
It's almost right. Yeah. I mean, Glenn, it's almost an oxymoron.
Yeah, it is.
Because the reason podcasts work is because you can listen when you want.
Exactly.
That's why podcasts work.
And people.
Wait a minute. It's 12:30. Let me dial into Hardcore History at 12:30.
Yeah.
What? Are you kidding me? Are you kidding me?
Tell us how you really feel.
All right. So one final question.
I am a little opinionated about this.
That's why I love Tony. So one final question for you is, we're independent podcasters, and that's how we met. We met at an independent podcasting conference.
Right.
Do you see, so if coming from the radio side, where do you see independent podcasters fitting in after radio is forced to dive full steam into podcasting because of sponsorship, because of media buyers? Where do you see the independent podcasters living? How do you see that all playing out?
I think there's a great opportunity. Okay. I don't see it being a problem at all. And the reason that I don't see it being a problem at all is because radio is so corporate. And for people who produce podcasts such as yourself that don't necessarily fall into a box or fall into let me put it this way, a big enough box.
Right.
They're going to want scale. They're going to want size, because that's the DNA, right? Radio's DNA. They don't call it broadcasting for no reason. The radio's DNA is mass audience, mass audience, mass audience, mass audience. What the folks who are advertising now in podcasts, which is mostly direct response guys, what they know is that it's okay if they can buy a show that only has a couple of thousand downloads a month, and I know that number's getting a little higher, but if they can buy a show with a relatively small audience that also helps them sell razor blades, meal kit deliveries, mattresses, socks, flowers, what have you, they don't care because they sold product. I don't think broadcasters understand that. I think broadcasters, we're used to, hey, we have the country countdown. It's on 400 radio stations. We have, hey, it's the blah, blah, blah conservative talk show. He's got 4.6 million listeners. I think that's where, and I think that for independent podcasters, right. I think for independent podcasters, I think that it'll be two different businesses almost. It'll be the podcast ones of the world who are trying to get big celebrities because they can use the names of the big celebrities to try to pull big numbers, whether or not the content's any good.
And it'll be...
So I think there's a huge opportunity.
Yeah. And there'll still be me out there with the Horse Radio Network owning that world.
Yeah, and we can almost liken it to,
right.
This just occurred to me, we can almost liken it to, broadcast television versus YouTube. YouTube's not going anywhere. And even though broadcast television was it is here first and everything else, it's the big kahuna for entertainment. YouTube is still paving the way, and independent content creators are still doing really awesome things on that platform. And I think if radio wants to, continue to cast a big net and get into the podcasting business, all it's going to do is get a bigger spotlight on all of the audio entertainment that's out there, including independent podcasting.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think that's absolutely true. And I think that, if, at least in the short term, if terrestrial broadcasters shine a light on the podcast world in general, that's good for everybody. Because, the rising tide.
It's definitely good. I think that's, getting advertising to the mainstream. When you said about iHeart advertising, that made my day. Because all we're doing, you're right. Yeah. What people are going to do is they're going to go on there, and then they're going to go and they're going to search for horse. And all of a sudden, my shows are going to come up. But we first got to get them listened to a podcast. And the new numbers, that just came out show that we still have to advertise outside of the podcast listening audience.
Agreed. And the most expensive part of this is audience aggregation, right? The most expensive part of this is what iHeart is trying to do right now, is getting an audience. If you don't have the megaphone of a radio network, where we're blessed with Bob and Sheri, we have over 1 million people a week that listen to the show. That's a pretty big megaphone to tell people we got a podcast,
right?
Or frankly, anything else. But if you don't have that megaphone of radio stations, what are you going to do? You're going to buy Google ads? How are you going to get people over there? That's an awful expensive per listener, per subscriber. That's an awful expensive proposition that most independent podcasters can't afford.
No.
So yeah, I think if the aggregators, whether it's radio.com or whether it's TuneIn or whether it's iHeart, really get out there and say, hey, listen, there's this whole world of audio that, it'd be better if iHeart, said, hey, we have something for everyone. Go check out this app. That'd be even better. But, because they're pushing the stuff they want to push.
Right. But it still educates people.
It's good news.
Yeah, when we just did a study with the Horse Radio Network listeners, and number one, 60% found us through a search through a podcasting app. So they got to the app somehow, listened to another show, they searched horse and found us. So that's, that says something right there. That's 60%. Well, Tony, this has been fascinating. Thank you so much for joining us. I will tell everybody, look, I will plug for you. If you want to listen to my favorite podcast, you go to any of your podcast players, search Bob and Sheri, SHERI, or search Bob and Sheri, the Oddcast, and you'll get both of their shows. And they're absolutely wonderful. I listen every day. I have not missed an episode, and Tony knows this, since they started. So that's a lot of years.
Thank God, man. I appreciate the loyalty.
I'm the one dedicated person you have, Tony.
You're the one guy.
I'm it.
And I'm glad. You just need to download more often. But listen, I appreciate it, and I appreciate the opportunity to chat about the business with you guys.
And we'll see you, everybody listening to this, our podcasters, so we'll see you at Podcast Movement then.
And
we will see you at Podcast Movement in sunny Orlando.
Reach out to Tony, the Walmart of, what was it again? You're the Walmart of...
the Walmart of talent representation.
Yeah, that's right. Hey, we need representation there, Jemmy. We need representation. We can afford Walmart. So, thanks, Tony.
I'm rolling back the prices.
You are listening to the Florida Podcast Network, the voice of Florida. FPN is committed to promoting local brands and businesses through a network of podcasts celebrating the Sunshine State, and you can be a part of it. We'll make it easy to showcase your brand through the power of podcasting. Our team has successfully worked with over 50 companies to help promote their brands. Target our niche audiences through ads and host-read commercial spots on individual episodes, or contribute content to a show on a regular, ongoing basis. Make your brand part of the FPN family. Head to floridapodcastnetwork.com/partner with us for more information, to download our media kit, and to reach out. The Florida Podcast Network, celebrating Florida one local brand at a time.
Well, that was absolutely fascinating, and is certainly something that has come up in conversation at the various conferences we've been at.
Yes, thank you, Tony, so much for giving us so much of your time and just really helping to allay some fears that a lot of people have had that we've heard in the halls at different conferences and things about, oh my gosh, radio's getting to the space. Our hair's on fire. What do we do? And lots and lots of questions involved. And I think it's just full of opportunity. And it was a really great conversation to dive right into that.
Very good. Well, many thanks to you for stopping by. We hope that you join us again. You can visit all of the great shows on the Florida Podcast Network. We have several of them, including this news show. You can find them at floridapodcastnetwork.com. Until next time, thanks for hanging out on the inside of Florida's podcasting industry.